Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the IMechE webinar on Becoming the Boss. My name is Rob Austin-Goodall. I'll be moderating this webinar presented by my colleague, John Hattam. Thank you for those who've turned up. During the webinar, please feel free to ask any questions, and to do that, if you can type them into the chat function. If you haven't already done so, you can access this by clicking on the attendee chat button in the bottom right hand corner, the yellowy sort of orange button, and that will take you to the chat. Many of you have already, and thank you very much for that. Rob, if you can have the next slide, please. Excellent. Thank you for that. As you'll see here, along with this presentation that we're doing today, there are a number of workshops that we do in conjunction with this. Here are a few of the ones that are running this year and into next year. Please click on the QR code if you need to access them, but you can see these very much dovetail in with the content that John will be talking about over the next 45 minutes or so. And on that note, and as John's appeared in the top right hand corner, hi John, I'll hand over to him.
Rob, thanks very much. Good to see the 57 people who have joined us so far, and as Rob says, a warm welcome. In total, about an hour, about 45 minutes of me sharing a few thoughts on it at the end for any questions that you might have. Do keep the questions ticking over in the on this particular platform. It works better if I don't. If you'll see me, great. So a bit about me. I've spent nearly 40 years in business. You're at this stage, John, you don't look old enough, but no one ever does. Mainly in sales and marketing and operations. I've done the sales director job, run a couple of factories, spent some time in marketing, and I've worked very closely over the last 17 years with IMechE and to deliver a lot of their core skills program around leadership and management. A bit more about me there. I put on that not because you're remotely interested in what passes for my career, but just so you know that what we're going to talk about over the next 40 minutes or so is built in real life experience rather than it's just something I've read in a book or found on the on a blog. Great. Next slide, please. I wonder if so this is the agenda that we're going to go through. It matches, as you'd expect, the agenda that we put on the website. So we're going to look first of all a bit about what's the difference. Is manager? Is it a leader? Is it the same thing? Do I need to do one or both, or what's the difference? We're then going to think a little bit about what is leadership. Big subject, but I'll try and condense that down and give you some provocation and some thoughts on that. We're then going to think about three essential leadership elements and get your thoughts on that and share mine. We're going to think a bit about the characteristics of effective leaders, as well as the behaviours that are really important in leadership. And we're going to think about the importance of what I've called a leadership credo, being clear about what's important for me personally and for you personally in your leadership journeys. And then we're going to think in a bit about motivation. Is it all about money and bigger cars, or is there something more fundamental that we can tap into to motivate the people we lead? And then finishing off with a few thoughts on the importance of purpose and the idea of starting with why. Next slide, please, Rob. And I apologise to colleagues for the next slide vibe. I know it's a bit Matt Hancock and the Downing Street briefings during the pandemic. It just works a bit better that way. So I hope you'll forgive us. No, let's dive straight into the manager leader. What's the difference? Next slide, please, Rob. And here I'd just like to get you some of your thoughts in the chat box. What do you think about what the difference might be between a manager and a leader? So let's get a few thoughts in the chat box, and Rob will paste some of those and let me know what's going on. So I'll give you 30 seconds. You have to be quick. What do you think is the difference between a leader and a manager? So what have we got? Okay, we're getting a few thoughts in there. What's the difference between a leader and a manager? Okay, so leaders create a vision, someone says. Managers create goals. Managers keep things running smoothly. Leaders inspire the team, says Andrew. Leaders build a culture that people want to follow rather than being bound by duty. These are really interesting thoughts and ideas. A leader sets the direction. Manager ensures that it's executed. Hey, I love some of these thoughts. A leader is more inspiring somehow, says Graham. Leaders lead by example. Managers rely on authority. So, lots and lots of thoughts about leaders and a manager. Really appreciate the way you kept that chat box ticking over there. Rob, next slide. What I'd suggest to you is that both are necessary. Leaders concentrate on doing things, doing the right things, i.e. effectiveness. Managers concentrate on efficiency, doing things right. And that's a really important distinction, isn't it? Because to use the analogy of a ladder, we can climb a ladder very efficiently. We can do things right. But if the ladder's propped up against the wrong building, then there's not much point in climbing it at all. So, there is a great danger of doing things efficiently that should not be done at all. So leaders concentrate on effectiveness. Next slide, Rob. What I've got on this next slide here is two columns. And you can see on the left-hand side, we've got what I regard as leadership duties. And on the right-hand side, what I think are primarily managers' duties. For those of you who are leaders or are aspiring leaders, or perhaps have just started your leadership journey, or you're perhaps an established leader, just take 20 seconds to look at those lists. Leader on the left-hand side, manager on the right-hand side, and just give us a few thoughts in the chat box. If you had to look at your time and how you allocate it, it was a pie chart, how much of it would you be spending on the left-hand leader column doing those activities, and how much would you be spending on the right-hand side on the manager column? Let's have a few honest answers and reflections in the chat box. Where are you spending your time? Just a couple of percentages. Put L something percent, M for manager something percent. Let's see what people are thinking about. So Matthew has kicked us off. He thinks it's about 60-40 leadership management. What about the rest of you? About 50-50, says Dan at the moment. And there's a lot to take in there. Andrew's saying 25-75, 50-50, 8% leadership. Yeah, interesting point from Ashley. 80% leadership, 20% managing, but only the 20% seems to get recognised. 70-30, management 70, management 80. I mean, there's a load of interesting stuff coming out there. I haven't analysed them scientifically. They're all sort of coming through at warp speed in the chat box. I would suggest to you that most of you are spending more of your time on the management side, 30-70, 30-70, 25-75, 40-60, some of the latest numbers that are coming through. Why do you think that is? Next slide, please, Rob. Why do you think most of us are spending more time on the management stuff than the leadership stuff? Any quick thoughts in the chat box on that? There have already been a few comments in the chat box about why that might be. But why do you think, if indeed you're one of the people spending more time in the management column, why is that? What's going on there, do you think? You might be micromanaging, Jeffrey. It's rarely great to be micromanaged. So if we're sort of think we might be guilty of that, we want to take a step back. Yeah. it's a more visible output, says Vicky. You know, people see reports and targets and everything else. That's a really valid reason often the time, yeah. Yeah, Joe, that's a really good point. Skills learned during engineering and training development. And I'll say later on that the things that made you a great engineer are not necessarily going to make you a great leader and or great manager. It's one of the pitfalls that we need to think about. And I'll say a few words on that towards the end. Yeah, Paul, you know, very honest, I want to remain technical. You know, I'm a contractor. That's what I do. That's what I'm good at. It's quantifiable. It's much easier to see it. So yeah. Yeah, sort of manager's easier to define, isn't it, Charlie? A leader is more open. You know, how do I define that? It's perhaps outside my comfort zone. It's less quantifiable. It doesn't get recognised. All these reasons for leadership. I'm loving the way that you're interacting. Please keep it going. Rob, next slide. So let's just think about a little bit about what leadership is. You've given me some clues in terms of what you think leadership might be about. Next slide, Rob. If you look, last time I looked on Google, and you need to build the slide, Rob. Last time I looked on Google, it said there were 310 million results. If you type leadership into Google, you get 310 million results. If you type leadership into Amazon, other booksellers are available, you get about more than 50,000 results. Okay, so it's a huge subject. It fascinates us. And my job in the next 34 minutes is not to neatly define leadership for you and to sort of wrap it up into a little bow and then sort of say, there you go, you don't need to worry about these 310 million search results. This is leadership. Of course, it's much more complicated than that. But next slide, Rob. But there are a lot of misunderstandings about leadership. A little one I came across here. You know, leadership. I understand the problem. I have a plan. Now just do what I tell you. There are lots and lots of facile understandings of leadership that think it is about becoming aggressive and finger pointing and directing people. And actually, as we shall see in a moment, that's a very ineffective way of leading. I remember in my early career, I was probably somewhere in my late 20s, early 30s, just beginning to, you know, get some leadership responsibilities. And I was lucky enough to listen to a guy called Peter Brabeck. He was an Austrian guy, and I was working for Nestle at the time, and Peter was the CEO, worldwide CEO, and he used to do lots of these visits to markets around the world. To encourage us, I think might have been the word. And very rare that anyone actually asked him a question. When we got to the, you know, right, any questions? And everyone used to sort of lower their eyes a little bit and avoid catching his gaze. No one wanted to be the one that sort of asked the wrong question. But one day someone did ask him a question. They said, it was a rather sycophantic question. They said, Herr Brabeck, you are the CEO of a world-leading multinational global company active in 160 markets. Nestle sell 20 billion products every day. What for you does leadership mean? And the rest of us sort of quietly rolled our eyes, you know, at such a codying question. But what Peter said next has always stuck with me. Next slide, please, Rob. He said, oh, well, leadership's really, really simple. He said leadership is about setting the strategic direction and resource, number one, allocating resource in line with that strategy and that direction, and thirdly, becoming personally involved in some of the critical success factors that will deliver that vision. Now, you know, amongst the many, many definitions of leadership I've come across over the subsequent 30 odd years, that one has really stuck with me. I think it stands the test of time. So if we want to be leaders, first of all, are we setting a clear strategy and direction? Are we allocating resources in line? If you set a strategy and then allocate all your resources somewhere else, don't be surprised if people go galloping after the perverse incentives that you've set them. Are we allocating resource and direction, resource in line with that strategy? And are we becoming personally involved? Another CEO of my acquaintance has a great saying. He says, leadership is a contact sport. Leadership is a contact sport. In other words, we won't be effective leaders by trying to dodge the hard conversations. We won't become great leaders by hoping things get better. They very rarely will. Leadership's a contact sport. We need to, grow our competence in having some of these difficult conversations. Growing people, recognizing them, providing them with autonomy, providing them with choice. Helping them achieve things, helping them feel like they're growing. There's a whole wealth of research that talks about what leaders do, but I keep coming back to this little definition. Rob, next slide. So that leads us on to saying, okay, that's one definition of leadership. If I asked you to distill leadership into 3 elements, I wonder what you'd say. What do you think needs to be present? And I'm going to give you one of them. And one of them is that a leader needs to be present. Clearly, if there's going to be leadership going on, a leader needs to be present. What do you think the other 2 essentials that need to be there as well as a leader if leadership's going to take place? Give me some thoughts in the chat box. Let's have a few thoughts. A leader. What else? What other 2 things might be necessary if we are going to be if leadership is to take place? Caring, says Andrew. Yeah, that's certainly true. Leadership's about building relationships, but in terms of which factors need to be at play, confidence and clarity, trust and motivation. Well, they're all coming out now. And actually, you're giving me some great answers to a separate question I'm going to ask you at a moment. In terms of characteristics of successful leaders. So you might want to come back with some of these things that you've written in the chat box very, very shortly. But I want to suggest to you that as well as a leader, we've already talked about a vision. So a sense of where you're going to, what's the strategic direction. A leader sets a vision. He's got a direction. He or she knows where they're going. Next slide, Rob. But I'd suggest the third element, as well as a leader and a vision, is that we need some followers, don't we? I've come across so many models of leadership that seem to stress being tough, dictating to people, telling them what to do, not taking no for an answer. And actually, when you look behind you, if you're a leader and there's no one there, how can you, in any meaningful sense, consider yourself a leader? Leaders need followers, and the key definition of a leader is that people are prepared to follow you. So you can call yourself a leader, you can have it printed on your business card, you can have it on your email signature, you can have it on the door of your office, but if no one is following you, you are not a leader. So just a little bit of food for thought there. I can only consider myself a leader if people are actually following me. Rob, next slide. So we've talked a little bit about manager, leader, what's the difference? We've talked a bit about leadership and what it is. And I've suggested that there's 3 essential elements to leadership. You need a leader, you need a vision, which I noticed 1 or 2 of you put in the chat box, and you need followers. So this is where I'm going to ask you, next slide please, Rob, just to brainstorm. In your experience, and I hope that many of you have had the experience of being led by a great leader at some stage in your career, but what are the characteristics? So this is where I'm sorry if I'm going to get you to duplicate it, but what do good leaders do? How do they behave? Definition of behavior: everything I say, everything I do. Okay, there's a definition of behavior. Everything I say, everything I do. So when you think about the behaviors of successful leaders, and forgive me if you think, oh, I thought I'd already written that, but just please, if you put it in the chat box again, what in your experience are the characteristics, the behaviors of successful leaders? What do they do? How do they behave? Okay, chat box ticking over nicely. taking responsibility and influencing people. They're trustworthy. And Glenn, I could sort of break that down. Perhaps you want to reflect on this and give me some thoughts in the chat box. They're trustworthy. I agree, good leaders are trustworthy, but trustworthy isn't a behaviour. Mark Carney, the ex-governor of the Bank of England, he talked about the 2008 banking crash, and he said, trust arrives on foot and leaves in a Ferrari. Trust arrives on foot and leaves in a Ferrari. So there must be behaviours that allow me to become trustworthy or to trust other people. And you might want to give a bit of thought as to what those behaviours are. So they're motivational, and they are. And we might, again, David, want to think about what they do to make them motivational. They're good listeners, absolutely. They're good comms. They respect people and their ideas. So again, it's interesting, isn't it? Respect, I don't think, is a behaviour. Yes, I can behave respectfully, but what does that mean? What am I doing when I'm behaving respectfully? They're good at motivating and it's inspiring. They lead by example. They understand and support. They communicate. They mentor. They communicate a vision. They listen. They encourage. They're positive, determined, confident, and passionate. You know what strikes me, colleagues, about those lists that we've put in there, and I think they're all true at different times for different leaders. Two things strike me, and I hope they'll strike you as I just say a few words about this. First of all, if you think back to the question about are leaders made or are they born, and I give an emphatic answer to that leaders are made, they're not born. We'll perhaps touch on that at the end of the webinar. But if you look at all those behaviours, those characteristics, they are not innate qualities. They're not things I'm born with. They're not things you're born with. You know, whether you decide to listen to people, whether you decide to communicate to people, whether you have time for people, whether you care for people, whether you choose to be humorous, whether you choose to be empathetic, all these words that are coming out in the chat box. These are decisions that I take as a leader every day in terms of deciding what sort of leader I'm going to be. I can't choose other people's behaviour, but every day I get to choose my own behaviours. That's true, isn't it? No one chooses my own behaviours for me. I get to choose my own behaviours every hour of every day. So I'm suggesting to you that one of the encouraging things as we think about leadership is that a lot of what you have put down there, in fact, almost everything you have put down there, is a behaviour. So if I want to be a good leader, it's not worrying about whether I was born a good enough leader or whether I'm a natural leader. It's about identifying some key elements of leadership, some key leadership behaviours, and saying, today, I am going to behave in that way. That's quite liberating, isn't it? It's all about behaviours. The second thing I want to suggest falls out of everything you've written in the chat box. Someone said determined. And then someone said, a good listener. You could say, well, actually, being determined might not necessarily always fit very well with being a good listener. Being supportive might not always fit very well with, as someone else has put, being directive. Communicating a vision might not always fit with listening to people. In other words, sometimes these things that we put in the chat box are in conflict. I can't be all these things all the time to everybody. So I think the second thing that we recognize about leaders is that they are situational. They read the room, they read the person they're talking to, they read the context, they read the situation, and they choose the appropriate behaviors. I don't know if there's any golfers amongst you, but the reason you've got 14 clubs in your caddy is so you can choose the appropriate club for the appropriate shot. You wouldn't want to go around a golf course hitting everything with a putter or a 4-iron or a sand wedge. You select the appropriate club. And good leaders are always situational. They don't always behave in the same way. Sometimes they'll be very supportive, and sometimes they'll be really, really directive and telling people what to do. So leadership, someone's put, Amal's put flexibility, and flexibility is partly about determining my style. So two things. about characteristics of successful leaders. First of all, it's behavior based. I get to choose my behaviors, that what's important. And secondly, I need to flex and vary my leadership behaviors according to the situation and the context that I find myself in. Next slide, Rob. So that's working, isn't it? We're halfway through the agenda, and we're about halfway through the time allotted. So so far so good. So I've just said everything is about behaviours, and I thought I'd switch my phone off. I'm so sorry about that, because I have now. I've said everything's about behaviours, and so let's just explore that a little bit more. Next slide, Rob, if you wouldn't mind. A little quote here. It's actually from a lady in the 19th century called Emily Dickinson. She says, behaviour is what someone does, not what they think or believe. To a certain extent, what you think or believe is largely irrelevant to how effective a leader you are. Leadership's about what you do. Next slide, Rob. And I've been very influenced over the years by both these books. One of them still very much in print, and the other one no longer in print. But the one on the left, Why Should Anyone Be Led By You? It's by a couple of guys who did this huge evidence-based exercise where they looked at, they did a whole raft of interviews with managing directors, CEOs, successful senior leaders. And the question they asked is the most terrifying question that perhaps any of us could be asked. And the question was, why should anyone be led by you? Just think of someone asking you that question right now. If you're a leader, why should anyone be led by you? I wonder what you'd say. Because Goffey and Jones, the authors of this book, identified two very important characteristics that kept coming out of these interviews. Number one was authenticity, being ourselves. Too many of us, particularly when we start out on our leadership journey, we try to be someone else. We try to be our boss. We try to be a successful leader. Let me just deal with this phone permanently. Someone doesn't want to take no for an answer. There we go. That's powered off. We try to be someone else. We try to ape our current boss. We look at someone else in the organisation. There's lots of books that encourage this fallacy, aren't there? You know, Leadership the Richard Branson Way, you know, Leading Like Alex Ferguson, Leading Like Jack Welch. And they're all entertaining books and good reads, and we might pick up a few lessons from them, but they're fundamentally useless because I'm not Richard Branson, I'm not Alex Ferguson, I'm not Jack Welch. And one of the great lessons that I hope most of us eventually learn about leadership is that our power lies in being us. Oscar Wilde famously said, be yourself, everyone else is taken. Be yourself, everyone else is taken. And the more we try and pretend to be someone that we're not in leadership, the less effective we are. So whatever you start from, whatever your behavioral preferences and personality, that is where your strength as a leader lies, not trying to be someone else. I find that sort of quite reassuring, really. And the second thing they found out in this study was something that you might not guess. The second thing was about vulnerability. Good leaders, on occasion, demonstrate their vulnerability. And that's only sensible because actually none of us are perfect. We all make mistakes, I think. Might not always admit to it, but we're constantly making mistakes. That's the human condition. So being able to say to someone, I've fouled up here, or I'm a bit stuck here, what do you think we should do? Is very, very powerful. Clearly, not all the time. We're not going to respect a leader who's constantly tripping over their own shoelaces, but occasionally admitting vulnerability, really important. So authenticity and vulnerability, take that away from today's webinar and practice being authentic and occasionally vulnerable. That's what good leaders do. The other book, very briefly, is from a guy who was a keen amateur yacht racer. And he wrote a book about a round the world yacht race and some of the lessons that he had learned from it. And the really interesting lesson that stuck with me when I read the book, he said there are two kinds of yacht skippers. There are the kind of skippers who go, rah, 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 we're going to win. We've all met bosses like that, right? But the second sort of skipper said, I don't know if we're going to win, but here are the behaviours associated with winning yacht races. And this is how I want you to behave. Okay? Much more effective way of leadership is to identify key behaviours. Next slide, Rob. In fact, go on 2 slides to the next slide as well, Rob. Many years ago, this is probably 25 years old now, but I sat down inspired by this and I wrote myself a little credo. Credo, as we know from the Latin, I believe. That's what credo means. And I wrote myself a little leadership credo. This is what I believe about leadership. And you can see part 1 on the slide in front of you. I'll give you 5-10 seconds to have a quick scan of that. And next slide, Rob. Part 2 is the rest of it. So this is what I believed as a leader, and I used to, talk to new people coming into my team. You need to understand what's important to me. You need to understand what I believe. You need to understand how you can expect to see me behave and how I'm going to behave, and how I want you to behave as you join my team. I'm just going to give you 60 seconds now. Next slide, please, Rob. Just to feel free to put stuff in the chat box if you want. That's absolutely fine. You might not want to share some of this stuff, I don't know. But just 60 seconds, scribble down a few things instinctively as they come into your mind. If you were writing a leadership credo, what you believe about leadership, what might be some of the really important things that are fundamental to your idea of leadership and your belief? How might you think about going about sharing some of those with some of your team? I'll just give you another 30 seconds, either in the chat box if you want to, or just to scribble down a few notes. What might be, Craig, that's a nice one. Be kind, think smart, work hard. Very concise, Craig. I'm impressed. Much more concise than my leadership credo. Nice one. Do feel free, anyone else, to stick them in the chat box there, or you might just want to be jotting a few thoughts down on a bit of paper. Yeah, Matthew, trust, communication, directive vision. That's great as a set of words, Matt, and I absolutely agree with all of them. You might want to, if you were talking to your team, flesh those out in terms of behaviours. So directive vision, what's that going to look like as a behaviour of how we're going to work together as a team? Nice one. Andrew's thinking about how can I serve my team and make them the best that they can be. That's a great one. Support others to be their best selves. Nice one, Ashley. Remember that people have lives outside work. We're not automatons. We don't we're not defined by our jobs. Win as a team rather than as a individual, quote unquote. That's a super one. The little things make up the big picture. You've always used that one, Dan. Great ideas. And some of you will have come up with some other things that you've perhaps not wanted to share in the chat box. Okay, let's look at the last couple of things I want to talk about. Next slide, please, Rob. Let's just think, one of the things that several of you said when I said, what are the characteristics of a leader? You talked about the ability to motivate and inspire. I don't know if any of you are familiar with the Dogbert and Dilbert cartoons. I highly recommend them if you are. There's a a boss who's utterly useless, known as the pointy-headed boss, and is always making every mistake that you possibly can as a leader. And then one little cartoon, he humiliates one of the team, and then you see him going off to say, "I'm just going to go and spread a bit more motivation over here." And clearly, just saying I'm going to be motivating, I'm going to be inspiring, doesn't take us very far. And equally, sometimes we can't always reward people, even if that was successfully motivating them, by giving them, lots of money or a promotion. It doesn't work like that either in real life. Next slide, please, Rob. And there's plenty of theory around motivation. It comes from that I've already talked about, credo, meaning I believe. Let's have another bit of Latin. Motivation comes from the Latin verb movere, which means to move. So when we are thinking about motivating someone, we are, if you go back to the Latin root, we are thinking about moving them from somewhere to a different place. Okay, so motivation is about movement, is about changing someone's outlook and attitude. And there's loads and loads of theory. If I were running a session, a 2-hour session just on motivation, we could talk about this. But we've only got about 2 or 3 minutes. So suffice to say, plenty of theory there from people like McClelland and Alderfer and Maslow and Hertzberg and others. I won't go into these theories. Except to say they're quite difficult to apply in a work context. Next slide, Rob. So my question for you, chat box here, is what motivates you? Try and think of a situation in which you felt motivated. Okay, you don't need to tell me what the situation is in the chat box, but just think to yourselves of a time, a situation when you felt motivated. And what was it? What were the elements that made you feel motivated? Just try and come up in the chat box with, it might be things like, I was trusted to get on with the work myself. Might be something that made me feel motivated. Let's see the chat box ticking over again. What sort of things motivate you? Let's have a few thoughts. More difficult questions, these, aren't they? But when you were last motivated, what were some of the things that motivated you? Great. Okay, we're going. Clive, a clear direction, a feeling that my work was valued and worthwhile, an achievable goal, achieving something. Knowing there was a long-term benefit. Again, back to this idea of worthwhileness. Being acknowledged for my skills and capabilities and recognised. A clear vision that we were doing the right thing, the end goal. The idea of completion and doing something, being given some positive feedback. Everyone felt involved. It felt worthwhile. Some praise, recognition, challenging projects, achieving deadlines, progression. Lovely, enjoying the work, and they're still coming in the chat box. I want to direct you to the work of a guy called Daniel Pink. Pink has written extensively on this subject. You'll find his work online if you want to read his book. It's called Drive, about the secrets of motivation. Next slide, Rob. And he talks about these 3 essential elements of motivation. He says there is extrinsic motivation, which is the things that motivate me outside my innermost feelings. Sure, a new car might motivate me, a bit of extra money might motivate me. But generally speaking, it's short-lived. We get used to spending the money. Our motivation levels revert to what they were. So extrinsic motivators can motivate us, but not very powerfully and not for very long term. He talks about intrinsic motivators, things within ourselves. And he talks about mastery, autonomy, and purpose. So autonomy, this feeling that we've got in our lives and in our working lives, some sense of self-direction. We've got some choice, we've got some autonomy, we've got some agency. We're not being constantly have someone breathing over us and telling us exactly what to do. That's really, really valuable to us. The idea of mastery, achieving something, getting good at something. Some of us do lots and lots of things outside working hours that we're not paid for. We might play an instrument, we might volunteer, we might learn a language. We're not paid for those things. Why do we do them? Because they give us a sense of mastery, and or they give us a sense of purpose, that what we are doing is worthwhile. And I want to suggest to you that if you just scan back up and down that great long list that collectively you've put in the chat box about why you felt motivated, I'd suggest that you could fit them fairly easily into one or more of those three boxes. It was either because I felt trusted to, and I had some autonomy to do the job. It was either there felt some kind of purpose to the job, it was worthwhile, it was worth doing, however I define that, or achieving a goal, there was something about mastery, about getting better at something. So, motivation is perhaps a little easier than we sometimes think. It's not about wandering around patronizing people and trying to, give them things and promise them things. It's about creating work conditions where people feel they have a degree of autonomy, they have a degree of mastery, and they have a sense of purpose, that we've joined the dots, we've helped people make sense of the jobs that they do. I was talking to a telecoms engineer recently, and they were working in sub-Saharan Africa. And they were very frustrated about the slow pace and the bureaucracy and all the aggravation. And they were saying, it's just such hard work, this, John. And I pointed them towards some research that talks about the correlation between mobile broadband coverage in sub-Saharan Africa and gross domestic product. And the fact is, every 10% of increase in mobile broadband coverage, it correlates to a 0.7% increase in GDP. So I said, you can either define your job as wading through bureaucracy and getting frustrated, or you can define your job as you are reducing rural poverty in sub-Saharan Africa. It's your choice how you see your job. It's probably both those things. But we have a choice in motivating people, in helping them see connections, helping them see what their job, why their job is worthwhile. Let's move to the next slide, Rob. We're nearly done. The final element I want to just talk about in this very brief 45 minutes is the importance of purpose. We talked just now about mastery, autonomy, and purpose, and I just want to expand a little bit on the last one and the importance of starting with why. Next slide, Rob. There's a guy, again, he's written a number of books. You'll find him on TED Talks and wherever, always worth listening to, a guy called Simon Sinek. And he says, people don't buy what you do, they buy why you do it. And if you Google the starting with why, not now please, video, so when you've got 4 or 5 minutes, you'll see a very entertaining video, getting a bit old now, but the truth of it still hold very true, about people don't buy what you do, they buy why you do it. And the point he makes is most of us start with what we do rather than why we do it. And it's much more powerful to start with why we do it. Next slide, Rob. Some of you will be familiar with this story. The date is 1962, the year after Kennedy had said we're going to put a man on the moon within 10 years. The year before, of course, he was assassinated. And in 1962, he visited the very embryonic, the very young launch pad in Florida that they were going to hopefully launch rockets from, in the years to come. And it was all covered in concrete and dust and didn't look anything like a place where you might start to put a man on the moon. And Kennedy went to the gents, and when he came out, he saw a janitor mopping the floor. And he said, being an empathetic guy, he said, "Hi, I'm JFK. I'm John Kennedy. What's your job here?" And the janitor said, "Mr. President, I'm helping to put a man on the moon." Okay. He could have said, what does it look like? I'm mopping the floor of the gents. But actually what he said was, I'm helping to put a man on the moon. And this sense of creating purpose for people in our teams is the sort of last element of leadership I want to talk about. A couple of things to wrap up. Next slide, please, Rob. So, and finally, next slide again, Rob, please. Just to go back to the question about leaders born or made, I hope I've gone some way to convincing you that leaders are not born. It's not about, can I be a leader? It's about, do I have the understanding and the emotional empathy and the determination to identify and model the behaviours that are associated with successful leaders? There's some research that says both EQ and IQ are important in leadership. IQ, how intelligent you are, and EQ, your emotional quotient, how emotionally bright you are. And the figures that I've seen are that 96% of your effectiveness as a leader is to do with your EQ, your emotional quotient, how emotionally aware you are, and 4% of it, yes, being bright does matter, but only 4% is made up. So the good news is everyone on this call is bright enough, because you might not be able to do much about your IQ, but you can all develop as time goes on your EQ. Next slide, please, Rob. And I said earlier, the things that made you a successful engineer might not make you a successful leader. The things that made you a successful engineer were, massive, often attention to detail, high levels of technical competence. But actually, if you think about leaders that think about some of the leaders of some of the big quoted companies in this country and other countries. Can they do the job of everyone in their organization better than those people can do it? Rhetorical question. Of course they can't. Of course they can't. And one of the hardest things about leadership, particularly for engineers, is letting go, recognizing that you're no longer primarily being employed to be better at everyone else at some technical competence. Think of an orchestra. You're no longer the first violinist. You're the conductor. And your job is to bring out the best in other people rather than do everyone's jobs in the team better than they can. Next slide, Rob. So very briefly, 10 top tips. We talked about why should anyone be led by you. You can build all these, Rob, so they come all 10 very, very quickly. I'm not going to read all these out to you. Time is against me, but perhaps one or two. As a leader, focus on being respected. You see people moving into leadership roles and focusing on being liked. Doesn't work. If you are respected, then 9 times out of 10, people will also grow to like you, but focus on being respected. Number 10, concentrate on being a fully paid up member of the human race. Next slide. Theodore Roosevelt famously said, people don't care how much you know until they know how much you care. Building relationships, being believable, being connected is at the heart of successful leadership. Rob, I'm going to skip the next slide so you can move straight through that, and I'll move on to the one after that. So I hope you've enjoyed this 45 minutes. I hope that you've got some insights, you've got something memorable from it. As Rob says when he started the call, as IMechE, we run a number of these courses. They're well regarded, they're well evaluated, they're very thought-provoking. Some of them are 1 day, some of them are 2 days. So if we've piqued your interest or in any of these subjects, do have a look at the IMechE website and see what might be available. Some of them are delivered by me, some of them are delivered by my other colleagues. Next slide. So 2 minutes over time, we're done. Thanks ever so much, the 103 people, I think, last time I looked, who are on the call. Rob, I'll sort of hand over to you to facilitate the question and answer session, and any questions that people might have. Thank you.
Thank you, John. For anyone who wants to ask a question, please do so in the chat box. We've got a couple from earlier on, John, so here you go.
Yes.
The first one I've got is, how do you convince you have the potential to be a leader to existing leaders when you're very technical and not perceived as a leader?
Great. Okay. So there's a couple of thoughts to that. When people don't see us as leaders, there might be several reasons. It might be about consistency. So sometimes people see me behave as a leader, and sometimes they don't. So actually, I might need to focus on consistency of my behaviours. Sometimes it might be about I am exercising these behaviours, but there isn't the visibility, so I might need to focus on the visibility of what I'm doing. Sometimes it might be I just might be mistaken. I might not be exercising the behaviours that are necessary for a leader, and I might need to sit myself down and say, am I genuinely exercising these behaviours? But I think my nutshell answer would be, start by working out what behaviours are important leadership behaviours in your company, and then find ways of consistently demonstrating those behaviours and drawing people's attention to them. So actually, when you have the conversation about I'd like to apply for the job, and they say, well, I don't think you're capable. Well, actually, here's what the job demands, and here's how I've consistently behaved and what I've achieved over the last 6, 12, 18 months. So actually, I think they are. And those are some of the ways I would think about changing or attempting to change perceptions.
Thank you, John. Rob, could you go back to the 10 characteristics as request for to have a bit more time to look at that? A couple of slides back. And there we go. Brilliant. Thank you. Another question here, John. Can you recommend any resources that would be useful for an aspiring leader, other than obviously our excellent courses that we run?
did the person put that last bit of the sentence in, Rob, or is that your build?
That's my license there.
That's your license. Okay. I'd recommend a few. Here's a random selection. So I've already mentioned a couple of books. One Be Led by You. I mentioned Dan Pink's thing on Drive. If anybody wants to drop me an email, perhaps Rob, you could just save me time and put my IMechE email in the box, john.hattam@imeche.org. If any of you want to drop me an email, rather than give you a great long response and reel off a whole load of books and websites, if you drop me an email to the address that Rob's putting in the chat box, I will send you gratis, free of charge, special premium bonus value, my book list that I keep up to date. And it's got 20 or 30 books and websites that I've found helpful, and that'll be a really good starting point.
Excellent. I think we're going to put the training email in the learning@imeche.org.
Okay.
Doing that as we speak. There we go. It's in there now. Right. Next question. We have how did you handle the transition?
Yeah, I can see it, the transition between your colleagues becoming your followers. It becomes easier if you have kept a little bit of professional distance. But I appreciate this is one of the sort of big things. I think what I was just overt about it. I said, look, we've always had a great relationship. Inevitably, it's going to change a bit now. But my ambition is to, maintain that really good relationship, albeit express it in a slightly different context. We'll both probably take a little bit of time to find our way into how that works. But my, clear intention is that I'm going to do everything I can to make it work. So I think sometimes it's about being overt and not sort of being this embarrassing subject that no one wants to talk about. So I think that's probably, in the couple of occasions. I actually had one worse than that. I had someone that was my boss, and then I was promoted into a role where he became my subordinate. So, that was a really tricky one with Mike. But we worked our way through it, with goodwill on both sides, and it worked. But again, focus on the respect rather than on the being liked.
A couple of things. Firstly, the slides and the recording of this will be available in about 2 weeks' time. You'll be sent an email saying that they're available and the link to get hold of it. And secondly, next question in there from Adam. John, if you can see it, how can you support those above you and lead rather than manage?
I'm just looking at that one. So how can I support Just say that again, Rob. Sorry, I can't see that at the moment.
How can you support those above you to lead
I
rather
can
than
see it now.
manage?
Sorry, I've got it. It's appeared. How can you support those above you to lead rather than manage? Partly by modelling, Adam. Going back to what I was saying about I can't change other people's behaviour, but I can always change my own behaviour. So I think for many of us, we are, and I'm not saying this is you, by the way, but for some of us, we're stuck in situations where we don't like the way our boss is behaving, and that gives us a fundamental choice, doesn't it? Am I going to just channel those kind of behaviors down, and because someone behaves badly to me, I'm going to behave badly to other people? Or, am I going to make a conscious decision to be a circuit breaker and say, well, that's how you're behaving to me, but this isn't how I'm going to behave to you, to my subordinates. And, I actually, not necessarily making a song and dance about that, but actually allowing someone to see that their behaviours are not how you want to behave. I don't know if you've got access to any of the CMI tools, Adam. Whether you're a member of CMI, whether you've got access. CMI, I've got a really good video on managing my boss. And lots of stuff to talk about that. It may even be accessible if you're not a CMI member, but that's the sort of resource that springs to mind that I've recently seen and thought about very effectively about managing the boss. So that might be one that you want to have a little dig around and see if you can find out. But yeah, concentrate on your own behaviours rather than trying to change those above you. That's all you can do. That's how ultimately culture changes. Because enough people decide they're going to behave in a certain way.
And I think that takes us to the end of the questions I had, John. Anyway.
Okay, great. Well, just we've got 5 minutes. Any last questions from anyone else? I'll just give people 30 seconds to put that last quick question in the chat box if you have it. It looks as if Adam might be drawing the conversation to a close. Okay, Rob, I'll hand over to you to wrap up. Thanks very much.
Excellent. Thank you, John. Thank you for that. Thank you, everyone, for turning up. We've got another one. There we go, John. Hang on. When vision direction is unclear, how do you feel that feed this into the team?
Yeah, that's a great one. Again, and I've had lots of experiences of this. Two parts answer, Tom. First of all, by trying to be clear about what's in my remit in terms of what I can do, what my team is going to do in terms of vision and direction, and how we're going to behave and what we're going to try and achieve. I think the second thing is, again, being really honest. I can think of a couple of instances in my career. Once when the company was going through all kinds of problems and retrenchment and redundancies. And I brought my team together and said, team, there's a lot of change going on around us here. I don't even know if we're all going to be together when we come out the other side. Some of us might not make it, but this is how we're going to behave as a team. In the meantime, there was a lovely little post. If you search for it on LinkedIn, Tom, there's a lovely little post from one of the managers of one of the Wilko stores recently. Right in the throes of the business going bust, everyone losing their jobs, and he posted something quite inspirational that said, "Well, this is the context I'm in, but this is how I'm going to continue to lead." And I thought, wow, what a great bit of leadership, what a great bit of sort of leadership behaviour. So, something else you might want to, if you're on LinkedIn, have a little root around and search for that, because it was really worth reading. Okay, Rob, back to you.
Excellent. Thank you, everyone. Can you elaborate on a bit on how to increase visibility? The question
Yes, I will. If again, just in the interest of time, I've got a whole couple of slides with a bit of detail on that. Rather than try and distill that into 30 seconds, if you could drop an email to the address that Rob has provided, pass it on to me, and I'll send you out a couple of slides that will elaborate on that and give you a few thoughts. You're very welcome.
Brilliant. Thank you, John. Thank you, everyone, for your participation. Been some excellent comments in the chat, excellent questions. Thank you very much, and we will say goodbye.
See you, team. All the best. Good weekends and good luck in your careers. Cheers. Okay.